Hermvids with Mr. Herman. Educational videos about reading and writing. Herman. Smooth teacher. Every word, poetry. Best teacher ever. Now, if you have a mind for poetry, you may have been able to identify that as a haiku. Haiku is a formal type of poetry. Formal means has rules. Formal wear for prom means you've got to wear a tie or a dress. Formal poetry is where you might have something like a rhyme scheme. You might have a pre-designed meter. As you're going to find, there are many different ways to write formal poetry, and I'm going to ask you to choose one of these types to work in for your next poem. Skill 3 is called working in type. I'm not talking about type like typing on a computer, but type like a fixed type of poetry. What does fixed type mean? Well, it's a great way to come up with new poems, because you can start with that type first and then work within the parameters of that type. They do have some restricting rules, so if you're more of a free type poet where you're not into following rhyme schemes, I'm going to ask you just try this out and see what it is exactly that you're more comfortable with. I'm giving you a lot of different types here, so it'd be beneficial for you to pause the video and figure out the ones that you're more interested in. One of the most classic types of fixed form poetry is the English sonnet. If you've read Shakespeare, you've probably read this because it was included in his plays. They're 14 lines long, and they have something called iambic pentameter. That is the amount of syllable per line count, 10 syllables per line. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That's 10 lines long. That's a line of iambic pentameter. Another element of iambic pentameter is something called unstressed and then stressed syllables. It's a pattern. So what happens is you would emphasize the second sound in a word set. So, shall I compare, kind of like that. It makes the writing a little bit more complicated, but it gives it a rhythm when you say it out loud. In addition, there's a rhyme scheme. And what the rhyme scheme means is the first and third lines, because they're both A, rhyme with each other at the very end. You can see that there are 14 letters here to correspond with the 14 lines of an English sonnet. Therefore, the first and third line rhyme, the second and fourth, and then a new rhyme begins. C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then the last two is a rhyming couplet. As I go over these types, you're going to see that they all have rhyme schemes, or at least some of them do. And they'll have some rules for meter or pentameter, the rhythm. Over here we have an Italian sonnet, kind of similar, with the exception of the rhyme scheme. It's a little mixed up. Still 14 lines, still iambic pentameter, just a different rhyme scheme in case you're interested in trying something new. Now we're going to mix it up with 3 other types of rhyme. There's a sestina, which is 19 lines, and this one is a little different in that you can see that the rhyme scheme has A's and B's, but there's also A1s, A2s throughout it. What that means is that line is actually the same exact line repeated. So if you're interested in this form, check out a sestina online and you can see what I'm talking about. But you would just copy and paste the A1 lines because they're exactly the same. So the 19 lines may be daunting, but it's a little bit less when you think of it that way. There's the rhyme royal, which is 7 lines long. There is a couple different rhyme schemes to choose from, iambic pentameter, and it's English in origin. There's the ottava rima, 8 lines, iambic pentameter, and a different rhyme scheme. This one is Italian. So you can see a lot of these have very slight differences, but depending on what mood you're in, you can use them for different purposes. I might butcher the pronunciation of a few of these. But the rondeau is 13 lines, and again you have those repeated lines. The A1s and the B1s, they're the exact same line over again. This one's French, and you should try to keep these the same amount of syllables per line. Also, when I put spaces, that's a different stanza. So that's one stanza, here's another stanza, and there's another stanza. If you're interested in that, I recommend writing out your repeated lines first, and then filling in the rest of them in between. The Sijou is kind of like a haiku in that usually there are nature themes, metaphysical themes. It's only 3 lines long, like a haiku, but it's longer per line. There's 14 to 16 syllables per line. There's also a formula for what each line is generally about. Line 1 is a problem, line 2 is the twist of the problem, and line 3 is a resolution, almost like a mini story, but it's kind of more a thought. That one is Korean in origin. We have a few more. The Spenserian stanza is 9 lines, iambic pentameter for 8. The last one is iambic hexameter, which is 12 syllables. And if all of these words are kind of getting you frustrated, you can look all of these up on Wikipedia. I recommend that. You've got your rhyme scheme here, and then your Greek and Latin origin. You, of course, don't have to write in Greek or Latin unless you want to. We have a Japanese poem called a tanka. 5 lines, syllable count, kind of similar to the haiku, except you got a 7-7 at the end, and there is no rhyme for the tanka, just like a haiku. Then you've got your, your triolet. 8 lines. Now this one is a little different. The 1st, 4th, 7th are identical lines. The 2nd and 8th are identical as well, and the rest that I didn't mention are something unique. So there's a lot of repetition in a triolet, which is French in origin. What I recommend you do is you go through this PowerPoint or this video, you find one that sounds interesting to you, look up a few examples online, and then try your hand at crafting your own version of the fixed form poem.